Hello and good afternoon to all of our viewers. This is RIUNIT from Colombo, and we are here trying to have our first podcast. And on the podcast, I'd like to introduce you to my co-host and my guest, Roshan Madawela, who is the founder and CEO of RIUNIT. Roshan comes from a wealth of experience, having previously worked for the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, Penwell Corporation in Essex, and the Institute of Public Policy Research in London, and has also served in the office of the advisor for the former Prime Minister in Sri Lanka. We also have Professor Bram Nichols, who is joining us from the Netherlands. He's a Sri Lankan economist and a social scientist. Retired associate professor in economics at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus Institute, University of Rotterdam. He has a wide range of experience in exposing and exposure in teaching around the world, mainly in financial economics. His in-depth knowledge and understanding of the global macroeconomic environment and its impact on the world economy have enabled him to make important contributions to economic policies debates in a number of countries, including Sri Lanka. And last but not least, we've got Bram Nichols, who is joining us from Vietnam. Is one of the co-founders and COO of the Economic Training and Information Services Company, IT, or ITIS as we'd like to call it, Sri Lanka. Before setting up the company, Bram worked for a consulting firm studying and trading in global equity, currency, commodity, and bond markets. Bram has continued his analysis of these markets in the context of global economic cycles, authoring the monthly Global Economic Monitor report and writing a blog. He's currently doing a PhD on industrialisation at the University of Colombo. So welcome to my co-hosts and my guests. And what I'd like to do today is try and kick off this conversation in trying to understand the geopolitical current economic status in Sri Lanka geopolitically, and we'd like to see how that has an effect on Sri Lanka and obviously globally as well. I think that Professor Harvard would like to kick off with.
Thank you, Jerome. Thank you for the invitation, RIUNIT. Happy to be with you, even though it's long distance from you. It's a really important and interesting topic because I must confess I was one of those that expected a global recession by this year. And the question is really whether we are in a global recession or headed imminently into a global recession. And from the data that I've gotten, primarily from Bram, it suggests not. It suggests that something happened which certainly I didn't foresee. And I think few of us could have foreseen. And for me, the starting point was what happened in the United States, which for me was quite a dramatic and massive expansion in the budget and industrialization push. So this was one of the starting points. And it wasn't across the board, but it was really in high-tech industries where the US injected this vast amount of money into high-tech manufacturing, basically. So it's something that we are told governments shouldn't do. They shouldn't interfere, but not only they, but we have data showing this is a worldwide phenomena now. Well, not a worldwide, but an advanced country phenomena, that all the advanced countries seem to be giving their manufacturing sectors a big push, especially in technologically advanced manufacturing. So that was the start. And now we see China also picking up, the Chinese government also injecting a lot of spending power into the economy and pushing high-tech manufacturing. So these two together could explain in part why, let's put it this way, not that the world economy is doing great and booming, but why it didn't sink as everyone thought it was going to sink. So I think that's the crucial point that needs to be made. And we have data, very recent data, showing that purchasing managers' indices are picking up. Notable exceptions up to now have been Europe and Japan. These are the two parts of the world where we haven't seen this pickup. So that would be my initial comment in response to that question.
My question to Howard was right from the get-go. Sorry, you said you got it wrong. You were expecting doom and gloom, and we're not quite there in that. So do you think it's becoming more and more difficult to make forecasts, medium and long term, especially, given the number of interruptions that we face in the world today, not least the advent of AI, which can be game changers. Just to give you an example, something that just sprang to mind, I was listening to an Indian politician basically telling an Indian audience what needs to be done in order for India to catch up with China. I think the year he had in mind was 2047. And for India would have to grow at 13.5% to catch up with India and the US. And he figured that even with a Modi government, obviously he was a Modi fan, and with all their AI students and IT students staying behind in India and not going to the US, the best they could do is like 9-10%. But then he brought the idea of AI and how India might use AI to use that to perhaps propel themselves nearer to where they need to go if indeed they want to be on the same level as China and maybe the US as well. So again, I wouldn't want to be in a seat where I was, making a forecast that's like, 18 years from today. So coming back to my question, is your job getting more difficult, Howard?
Certainly the long term remains forecastable, as it were. This AI revolution, this technological change that we're in at the moment is something that I actually lectured on and spoke about 25 years ago. And not only did I lecture on that, but I said that the whole economic philosophy was also going to change. In those days, it was no government intervention whatsoever, that all we had to do was get the budget deficit down and so on. And I was lecturing then that one day you're going to see the norm is running big budget deficits and printing money to finance those deficits. And without exception, all my students laughed at me. More recently, they ask, why? Why did you say that? And my answer is something that we have worked on for quite a long time, something called long business cycles. And we expect at a certain phase, technological change becomes clustered and the whole system convulses and goes into change mode. And along with that comes huge government intervention. And it's not just running big budget deficits, but actually nurturing and promoting the adoption of this new technology, because it's not going to happen automatically and never has done. It has to be nurtured, has to be supported, but the trick is we do it, you don't. So that's the game that is in play at the moment. Hence, the many missions to China trying to urge them not to do as we are doing. Rather, do as we are telling you. Don't do as we are doing. There's no chance. China is too far ahead for them to accept that. And China now is embarking on the same, aggressive promotion. I mean, they've already been promoting their manufacturing, but it's been low value added. So long term, everything is intact, but the short term has always been this problem because government intervention has always had the ability to change the course of what we call the shorter business cycles.
That's right.
And I learned it the hard way in 1998 when Alan Greenspan did something he wasn't supposed to have done in response to the East Asian crisis. So basically, we were coming near the top of the cycle, and he wasn't supposed to run a budget deficit going into the top of a cycle because that is going to blow the lid off the economy, which it did. That's why we had the so-called dot-com bubble. But it caused people like me to lose a lot of money because I expected interest rates to start falling, especially long-term bond interest rates. And instead, they went on another leg up. Eventually, they did fall, but not after I lost a lot of money. And I'm presuming lots of other people, but perhaps there weren't as many as stupid and stubborn as me. That was perhaps the first time I realized that you have to keep watching carefully and also listen carefully to what the policymakers are saying. And what we're now seeing, of course, is another instance of this. But don't forget, we've had this whole period, 2009 to 2021, with the great monetary experiment, where again, policymakers have intervened in a way that nobody anticipated. I mean, no one expected the West to print such a vast amount of money and drive interest rates artificially down to absurd levels, minus 0.3%. I mean, come on. When you're talking of minus 0.3%, it means to say that you are paying the borrower to borrow money from you. I mean, that is lunacy of the highest order, obviously.
Never happened to me yet.
And
yeah. I'd happily borrow some money and be paid to be borrowed.
And no one anticipated that. No one thought that that was possible, and no one realized the consequences of which were then compounded by the response to COVID. So all of these things had short-term distorting influences, and that, of course, does make it much more difficult than if the government says, we're hands off, we'll let the cycle play itself out in the normal way. Then, forecasting and anticipating the movement of key variables is much easier. I mean, it's never been really that easy because there's always been intervention. I mean, even when they say they're hands off, but this level of intervention is, of course, unprecedented, but not unprecedented for the bottom of a long cycle. I mean, this is standard stuff.
Yeah. So here's something that I read, which is going to support your theory a lot, right? So what we'll try and do is then try and bring this together and see how, where we can align the two, right? So the US Congressional Budget Office, right, hints at a future US sovereign debt crisis, right? And what it says is what made a difference what a difference 15 years can make. In 2008, the US public debt stood at 39% of GDP, right? And now that number is hovering around 100%. Okay. And what it further reads, owing to the combined fiscal pressure of the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic, the CBO's long-term estimates for 2020 estimates from 2024 onwards, pointing way to even greater heights, with a debt projected to hit 166% of GDP by 2054. So, like you said, I think there might be a plan that might be in place, which we don't know about.
I'm guessing so. I don't think the powers that be are that stupid, but one has to look at some historical analysis. I think Bram has done this historical stuff on debt, that we were in a similar situation, not exactly the same, because in a prior long cycle, or all prior long cycles, the base money was gold.
Yes.
Even though, let's say, the dollar and sterling were in effect world money, they were linked to gold. And this meant that there was an anchor, constantly an anchor. And you couldn't have governments just printing unlimitedly because of that anchor. They would have to support whatever they put out there with gold in the final instance at a certain given rate. But now, since 1970, 71, that anchor has been taken away. And so we're in a very different world. However, the movements are always the same. So what we do is we come to a point of massive debt. And that debt has to be somehow or another eliminated. Otherwise, we can't start the new cycle, because all cycles are based on expansion of credit, all. And no exception, unless we change the system, unless we say, okay, no longer have capitalism, we have something else, and certainly no longer have the current financial system, which the whole system is essentially a credit-based system. Yeah. Now, you can't have expansion of credit on the basis of so much debt overhang. That's not possible. And what you saw after the Second World War with the massive debt overhang is a destruction of debt. And that destruction of debt came with lots of bankruptcies, but also some inflation. But it was nowhere near this level. I mean, this level is much, much greater than we saw at that point. And the real question, which is what the Budget Office was hinting at, is how is that debt going to be destroyed? So there are two schools. There's the one that is looking at the Japanese way of destroying debt, and that's writing it off. And the other school is inflating it away. So there are these two schools, and the question is, for which most business people are asking, is which one of those two is likely to be the end game? I mean, if you start writing off debt, you're again changing the rules of capitalism. That means that debt is no longer that sword hanging over everyone's head, which disciplines a system. So that's an intriguing thought that you...
Yeah. Furthermore, just for the sake of our viewers and for the ones who don't really understand economics a lot, and this is a question that even has been pressing me over my childhood till now. So when all these countries are in debt, right, it's a very simple question. Who are they indebted to? Is that something that could be answered, in a forum like this, so that people understand a bit more? Who owes who money? And obviously we understand the fact that we are borrowing money to run our economies, right? And if, like, when you look at every single country, every one of the countries are in debt. So my question is, who are you indebted to, right? Is there something beyond a government? I know the IMF comes in play there, but then who owns the IMF? Who lends money to the IMF? And again, I'm bringing these questions up so that we can include, people who would like to understand a bit more about economics.
Well, if one looks at it globally, then the developing countries are in debt to the northern countries, basically. So if we talk of the global south, they're in debt to the north. Okay, so that's the basic. And that is also the way in which the south is disciplined to do what the north wants. Okay, and that debt takes several different forms. So up till recent times, we've had northern countries actually lending to southern countries, either directly or through the World Bank and IMF. Okay, so that's at a country level. But in the last 20 to 30 years, this has been supplemented by private banks and private investment institutions, again, of the North, lending to southern countries. Now, within countries, you also have debt. You have government debt, you have corporate debt, and you have individual debt. So government, and there's this wonderful video circulating. I've seen it now. I think at least a dozen people have sent me the same video. You know, this advisor to the Economic Council in the US. I think, Roshan, you may have even sent it to me as well, where he's asked, why is it that the US government that prints money actually borrows it? So firstly, they print it, lend it to banks, who then lend it back to the US government, and the US government borrows it. So why do they do that? And he sort of starts off very confidently, and then you can see he's totally confused. Yeah, yeah. Why are we borrowing?
Yeah, I think that's what do you call that? Federal Reserve. Right. So they created this entity called the Federal Reserve, and then they lend, they route money through the Federal Reserve. So who is the Federal Reserve?
So indeed, so what we have is a system in which there is a privileged strata of rentiers, you know, who actually do nothing to earn part of the profits of our societies, you know, except they're in a privileged position. They're given license. Remember, not everyone is allowed to borrow from the Fed cash, but commercial banks are. They're allowed to go to the Federal Reserve and borrow cash. And for a decade or more, that cash was being borrowed at between 0 and 0.5%. And then they on-lend it at between 1.5% and 2.5%, you know, including to the government itself. So it's totally ludicrous. And, you know, when we eventually get onto Sri Lanka, we will see we have now passed a central bank act in Sri Lanka, which is cementing the absurdity and insanity. That is that from now on, the central bank can't lend to the government money that it is printing. It prints it, lends it at very low interest rates to the commercial banks, who then go and buy government treasury bills. You know, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, you know. And I see all these people in the financial sector and so on pondering this thing, and they don't realize they're being taken for a ride. I mean, this is a joke. This is an absolute joke, you know, and I don't know.
And I thought the interesting thing there was that everyone seems to now have the view that the central bank can no longer print, right? Because now everyone is of the belief that printing is only when you finance the budget deficit. So that's the only time when the central bank actually prints. Printing to give to commercial banks is not considered printing. So even the other day at the Face the Nation with several experts there, economists, you know, they were saying, well, you know, now it's all better and we're very confident about the economy because the central bank can no longer print. I'm thinking, so in their view, the central bank could still print trillions and trillions of rupees, give it to the commercial banks, but that would not be printing in their by their definition. So, you know, the concept, the definitions have also changed completely. But I guess that adds to what you were saying.
I think it's an important point. I mean, going forward, I feel this is one of the most important points. The question is how we have all been suckered into this with incredibly bad economics. You know, economics that has now been discredited largely, but we still keep heading towards the precipice, you know, happily laughing and drinking our champagne and so on, and we're all moving in that same direction. But I think that caricature of that economic advisor was absolutely perfect. However, I think the underlying message of that has been missed by the vast majority of people. Vast majority will say, you see, these guys don't know what they're talking about. No, he knows perfectly well, but he came to a conclusion that this is ludicrous, but he didn't want to actually say it's ludicrous. This was the intriguing part of that video. I think we have to have that link. Have you got the link to that, Roshan? It would be good to have that in the notes.
So, Howard, may I quickly ask you, in terms of how the gold prices and the lower interest rates that we've been witnessing over the last few years, do you think that it is something that is a sustainable practice? Because obviously lower interest rates mean like a lot of people are able to borrow a lot of money, which then in turn they go out and buy so many other things, assets, property, land, equity, and so on and so forth. So obviously then the prices of these tend to go up. Now, how long can an economy withstand that sort of inflate, or rather deflated, purposely deflated lower income rates? And obviously at some point there's going to be an increased interest rate, and then there's going to be a correction. So is this something that you think we will see in the near future, or how do you think that's going to pan out?
It's really interesting. I mean, that's the thing that's bothering me quite often. I have sleepless nights about this because, you know, in a way, it's pointing to a major crash of asset prices. If we're right, if interest rates continue to remain high for a long time, especially in the US, which is the benchmark for the whole world, then there must be a reversal of the asset price boom that we have seen. Now, in part, those higher asset prices, and I think this is something that Bram can also comment on, are justified and are somewhat limited to a small number of high-tech companies. You know, they call them the Magnificent Seven in the United States that actually dominate all the stock markets and most of the increases. But the other interesting asset is gold. I mean, gold should have been a beneficiary, but it wasn't. And that is because something which is only really known in investment circles, but not outside investment circles, is the US and the Bank of England, the US Federal Reserve and the Bank of England have used, I think it is JP Morgan, but Bram, you can correct me. One trading desk there trades gold futures in order to keep the price down. And you can see it. I mean, many people have commented on it that the pattern is so crazy that whenever everything points to a rise in gold prices, suddenly, you know, this swathe of futures comes in and drops the price. And that has been happening for at least a decade and possibly a decade and a half. It doesn't serve the purposes of the BRIC countries that are now accumulating gold instead of US government debt as parts of their reserve assets. You know, this suppression of gold prices, and I think that's why you see gold prices rising, which they shouldn't do when interest rates are rising, because there should be a switch from a non-interest yielding asset like gold into interest yielding debt. But gold prices have been rising and rising really fast. And the feeling is that since the Chinese and the Russians have opened up gold markets in the last year or two, we're now starting to see gold moving towards what could be called its real value, and that has been suppressed for a long time. The other thing, and I come back to that, and that is, I think, where Roshan takes off with his comments, is on land prices, property prices, which are beyond serious. I mean, in the sense that they're ridiculous. They're so ridiculous that we know there has to be a major correction in the not too distant future. And that correction will have implications for the whole financial system, because property is used as collateral for so many transactions. So, it's something that I know the system doesn't want, but it's intolerable for ordinary people who are looking to start families and, pay for accommodation, buy accommodation, or even rent accommodation, having these prices burning such a massive hole. And that was the video today with Lena Petrova, that video that Bram and I were both referring to. I think that'll also be in the show notes.
The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and World Bank held their spring meetings in Washington, D.C. And typically, I would not even cover those meetings because they're just nothing to write home about if you follow the news and you do your best to connect the dots. However, these meetings were different, and I would like to take some time to explain why. The IMF actually criticized American, or I should say current administration's economic policy. We should not be surprised that Bidenomics received criticism, but what should surprise us here is that it was actually done by the IMF. And it can only mean one thing. Even those who up until now remained silent, completely silent, or even praised current policies for imaginary full-time labor market numbers and all these new jobs that were added on paper, now even they are starting to realize that they're having trouble saying half-truth or outright lies with a straight face. So here's what happened. The IMF stated that the economic policies are overheating the economy and effectively warned Washington that it is walking a thin line by running a $3 trillion deficit while ramping up its spending. Fiscal policy continues to struggle with legacies of high debt and deficits, while facing new challenges. Public finances risks are acute this year, as over 80 economies and economic areas are holding elections amid increased support for high government spending. What precisely is that high government spending? It's nothing other than military spending, because the United States and Western Europe, Western countries, are going through the process of militarization. Even the IMF is now saying, look, you are in a very, very bad situation, and it is so bad. Your economic and fiscal choices have been so incompetent and so ineffective that you put yourself in a terrible, terrible position running federal deficits this high for this long. You need to do something about this right now, and it should have been done yesterday. This is the report, and I'll just go ahead and highlight the most important key points, in my opinion. This is my favorite part, and I know that you will appreciate it as well. Crisis-era support measures should be immediately terminated, and the political budget cycle and the drive to further increase spending should be resisted. The report was released last week, and look what just happened. Look what happened over the weekend on an off day, on a Saturday. The United States House of Representatives passed a $95 billion aid package to Ukraine, to Israel, and to Taiwan. And if you are an American, do you feel that this was done in your best interest? I would love to hear your thoughts. Make sure that you leave me a comment below. Right now, the federal government has a cumulative deficit of $3 trillion. In fiscal 2024 alone, and I will remind you that government's fiscal year starts on October the 1st. So for the first 6 months of its fiscal year, our government has $1.1 trillion in deficit so far. In fiscal 2023, if you would like to compare, the government had a $1.7 trillion deficit. Now, halfway through the year, we're just halfway through their fiscal year, they are already at $1.1 trillion. What will be by the end of 2024? Well, at this rate, at the rate that we're going, I think all of us know the answer. In fact, no mass media will ever tell you this, but the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget just delivered some really bad news. And there is absolutely no way that those who voted in favor of that $95 billion aid package that will cost thousands of lives abroad, there's no way that they were not made aware of these numbers that I'm sharing with you right now. So the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget in a recent post stated the following: at this level, interest payments will surpass spending on both defense and Medicare this year. And I really hope that you're paying attention. Interest costs to service our national debt will exceed U.S. defense and Medicare expenditures in 2024, not 10 years from now, not 5 years from now, but this year in 2024. It is happening right now. And the interest expense will rise to become the second largest line item in the budget. This is what it takes to make the middle class disappear and to turn a once strong economy into a complete mess. It's already become a mess. Please take a look at what you should expect in the near future. By next year, interest is projected to reach a record 3.2% of gross domestic product GDP compared to 1.5% just 3 years ago, which exceeds the record set back in fiscal 1991. And by 2051, interest costs are projected to reach 5.9%, nearly 6% of GDP, and become the single largest line item in the federal budget. And we have to question, why is this happening? Is it incompetence? Is it by design? And you have to believe that somehow those who got to where they are today in a position of power, that they're not incompetent. Of course not. Perhaps the answer to that question is their interests don't align with ours. Maybe that's what it is. Why are we sending $95 billion of US taxpayer money, the burden that future generations will have to bear? Why are we sending that money overseas to sponsor ultra-violence? That is the question. That is precisely what is happening, and it is precisely what has been happening. So don't fall for distractions. There are so many shocking things right now, so many events that are taking place, that are happening every single day on a daily basis, things that several generations living today have never seen, never experienced before, not just the younger ones. It is important to stay focused right now on what truly matters and on our values. Try not to get distracted, but try to seek out meaningful information that will help you understand what to expect and how you can prepare for it. The message from the IMF to US lawmakers to stop running unprecedented deficits, as well as the official numbers that I shared with you, all of this data likely points to the fact that we have reached a point of no return. Everybody understands that, and the only thing that is left to do right now is engineer a response.
Where she's interviewing so many people who are living in camper vans, because they can't afford normal accommodation. And these are professionals, people with very good jobs. So this can't continue. And the dissatisfaction with this situation is just reaching boiling point. I know it's the same in the Netherlands, two professionals, both earning really good salaries, just cannot afford to buy a house like the one I live in, which is, I bought it as just a normal lecturer on a lecturer's salary. And this is impossible for, let's say, a lawyer and a doctor to buy my house now.
Roshan, how do you think that is in terms of looking at the Sri Lankan economy and through the eyes of the property market? Do you think that's a reflection of what Harvard has to say as well?
Right. Yes, Jerome. I think if I can take a step back with reference to what Howard was saying, essentially, the property market does have similarities with gold to the extent that investors turn to gold or property as a safe bet asset during times of uncertainty, war, turmoil, you name it. And this is a historical fact which I think can be proven with empirical evidence. So the property market probably goes beyond gold in its significance to the extent that it is also a very real asset that every single person in any population has an interest in. If you're renting, if you're not fortunate enough to own, you'll be renting or leasing. You might be a landlord, you might just be buying to live. Wherever you are, the property market is going to have some impact on you as an individual, a company, an entrepreneur, an investor. So it's also interesting that in 2008, when the economic meltdown in the US was triggered, it was, of course, the subprime property market which triggered it. And similarly, I think in the UK, there was a lot of dodgy lending, as it were, around that time. I know lots of people who were picking up properties everywhere. Let's go forward a decade. It's very difficult, as Howard said, for people to afford a house anymore. It seems the powers that be are making it very difficult for the average person, the young person, the working person to be able to afford to buy a house in the UK and many parts of the developed world. So they're pushed into renting, and their ownership of something that was through the generations considered as essential in part of your life cycle hypothesis, as we do in economics. Owning a house was very much integral to what we assumed would be the normal part of your economic life. So that's gone out now. But even during the recession, prime London, property prices in prime London kept on appreciating, which again tells you a bit more about the property market as it is today. The last huge impact, which many developers feared, was COVID. COVID wiped out occupancy in offices and retail real estate faster than an arrow goes through an apple. It just emptied out all the malls, offices were empty, even leisure real estate, hotels, no longer occupied. So there were many instances over the last 5 years when we saw that, which is quite remarkable, I think, in recent history. Yet and still, we are still here. We still work in offices, and retail malls have made a comeback. So let's now turn, as you said, to Sri Lanka to look at the economic crisis through the eyes of the real estate market, as RIUNIT monitors that very closely for our clients. Just to note, and I think Howard might find this interesting, interest rates have very rarely impacted the property market in Sri Lanka. And there are many reasons for that. And I think the most important one is the fact that a very large number of the population work overseas and send remittance money back. And they have been one of the most important channels through which people can fund property purchases at the lower end of the property ladder. So the number of people working in the Middle East, or if you're in the Philippines or Indonesia or Bangladesh, which has over 10 million migrant workers, these things have tended to supersede the impact of interest rates, which tend to have a more real impact in the developed world. That said, what we have witnessed during the economic crisis is, for the first time since we monitored prices, was a fall in the average land price in Sri Lanka. And the real human story behind that is an increase in the poverty level from 3 million people in 2019 to over 7 million people this year in 2024. 31% of the people living in some form of poverty with vulnerabilities in food security, and having to use all kinds of mechanisms in order to cope. One of which, of course, is mass migration, 1.1 million people leaving the country straight after the economic crisis, with almost 1 million new passports being issued. So the human story now reflects on the real estate charts. Let me just try to share something with you. Exchange rates, very important in a country like Sri Lanka, as I said, where so many people work overseas and send their money back to their families. The rupee has been holding up, and this is amidst an environment where the country hasn't been paying its foreign debt. So the rupee's had a chance to rally, and that's what we've seen here over the last so many months. Then we looked at the rupee and dollar prices of apartments. Apartments are a curious asset class in Sri Lanka, and one of the consequences of the crisis is that there's been no supply addition. Very few new projects have come on board. Hence, we were in a market where demand was constant, even if slightly stifled, because obviously incomes were down. But in the higher end segments, there was demand in an environment with little or no new supply. Hence, you can see that they have held somewhat, but nothing compared to, say, 10 years ago. What's more interesting is the dip. This dip is something we've never seen before in LKR priced land prices in the Colombo suburbs. We were pretty worried at the start of this year to see such a dip, which even during the war and when there was bombs going off in the capital, we did not witness a dip in land prices. So here's a story of the lag story of people leaving, people trying to raise money to send their kids overseas, putting properties on the market. And might I add the impact of IMF policies on SMEs. Many people I know were forced to pay loans by selling properties, particularly people in the SME sector. So here's a real worry, which fortunately seems to be picking up again. And we're just watching that for now. So yeah, I won't go into it too deeply, but the real estate market is, I think, a very good way to look at the crisis which took place in Sri Lanka.
Oh, thank you, Roshan, for that. You know what? Actually, there was a while ago that I watched a movie that reflected exactly what you said, like how the subprime mortgage market, was heading to a crash, and one of these analysts had picked it up. I think it was Inside Job, Margin Call, or Big Short, one of those three movies. So for our viewers who would like to go and watch one of those movies, I think is one of that will give you a clear indication of how, they predicted the 2008 crash coming and, the implications of it. So Bram, you know what? I was just going to ask you, given the fact that you're doing this the PhD on industrialization in Sri Lanka or globally, what do you see anything that would support these theories to say where the economy is going, and anything that we need to be fearful of, and for the people who are watching us to say thank you for the information, we really appreciate what you told us. So is there something that we are not saying like as an analyst that you would be able to pick or point out?
Well, interesting enough, Roshan was talking about it before, about now all of this hype surrounding India. A lot of people excited, high growth rates, booming stock market. I think it's one of the best performing stock markets in the world at the moment, and has been for the last few years, outperforming every emerging market, especially that of China, which has been performing quite badly. And so, everyone calls on the economists to now explain what's going on there. And, is it going to continue for the next few years? That's what everyone wants to know. And the projection that Roshan was talking about, I've also seen, I think it's about from an IMF economist, actually, who was making this projection of India being, I think, something like a 52 trillion economy by 2047. And I looked at that data and saw, right, for India to get there, they would have to do what China did from 2000 till now, which is probably one of the most impressive economic feats we've seen in history, for a country as big as China to improve living standards by that much and grow its economy by that much was truly awesome. And tellingly, a lot of the economists didn't actually predict that, didn't manage to see that one coming. But so now you get a lot of those same economists saying that India is going to do this for the next 20 years. Well, I imagine quite a few people are also skeptical about that projection because, us economists are famous for getting everything wrong. And my problem with the optimism has been that, unlike China, India has not really managed to industrialize. And actually, if you read most of the articles written about India, a lot of people talk a bit about, manufacturing, some manufacturing going on, especially multinational companies like Apple moving their production from China to India. But if you read the really serious articles, like, let's say, there are a few written by The Economist, which are quite good analytical, they say, in spite of this hype about India's manufacturing and Modi trying to promote manufacturing in India, it hasn't really translated into any significant industrialization. So, for example, China's manufacturing sector as percentage of GDP, which is one of the indicators that we use to gauge whether a country is really industrializing, is still to this day between 25 and 30%, and has been for the last 40 years, during its industrialization. For India, we're looking at between 12 and 15%. That's how low it is. And it's really not up to that level where we can say that they're even close to industrializing. So it means that Modi's policies are basically not making that much of an impact. Maybe on a state level they are. Of course, everyone talks about his policies in Gujarat and how they made an impact there. But on a nationwide level, it doesn't seem to have made a difference. And that's why I think I don't question the numbers that much. There might actually be high GDP growth, and there might be quite a significant portion of people in India that are seeing their incomes rise. But I think it's not sustainable. That's the main point. I think what it's been up to now is very much services driven, so IT services have been a big thing. If you look at India's exports, they've been very reliant on services. Again, to contrast what you saw and see in China and any of the other East Asian industrialized countries for that matter. And so that in itself is not going to create that dynamic economy, these services that you would need to see to take this growth forward, that you would need this growth rate that everyone is expecting to continue of, let's say, 7, 8, 9% for the next 20 years. And I think that's going to disappoint a lot of people who are expecting India to adopt this brand new model, right? Because they're saying, well, China did it on the basis of manufacturing. India can adopt a brand new model, never seen before. Because this is what no one wants to talk about. We've never actually seen any economy develop on the basis of anything else but manufacturing, So it's always been manufacturing that's been the basis for their development. And that is what industrialization is. From the very beginning, the Industrial Revolution in Britain to the most recent example where I am today in Vietnam. It's always been manufacturing. And now, again, the story is, like we've heard many times in the past, perhaps India can do it differently. You're in Sri Lanka at the moment, and I'll be going back there soon. How many times have we heard this story? Sri Lanka can do it differently, maybe can become a services hub of some sort, maybe a financial services hub, maybe use the strategic location, become a transport hub, Heard it so many times, but time and time again, it doesn't lead anywhere. And the one thing that everyone is trying to avoid like the plague is manufacturing, because what it invariably leads to is a discussion about how you then get manufacturing going, and this is what most economists want to avoid at all costs, because that's when we start talking about government aggressively promoting manufacturing. And, the neoliberal economists who are so gung-ho about the market being the ultimate dictator of how an economy should be run best, is sidelined in the process of industrialization, because every single case that we have, whether we're talking of the East Asian economies like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, all of them had governments that aggressively promoted manufacturing, and in all manner of ways. They used state development banks to give concessional financing to particular manufacturing companies. They used tax incentives to get foreign manufacturers to produce in their countries. And these are the sorts of policies that the more neoliberal thinking economists want to avoid, or at least they want to deny that this is what made them successful. So there's actually a clip that you have, maybe you can run it now, of Daniel Alphonsus on Face the Nation. They're saying that this is where productivity gains come from for the general economy.
Because the way we think about export promotion is about marketing campaigns and so on and so forth, especially when it comes to manufacturing FDI, which is the most important bit of FDI, because that's what really improves your productivity and generates a lot of employment. what does an investor look for? They're sitting in a capital center, in the US, in Japan, in China now, and asking the question, where can I produce this product the most cheaply? That's the question that's being asked. And therefore, what we need to do is create an environment where we can produce the most cheaply a given product of any place in the world. So that means we need to look very carefully at the costs of production. What is the land cost? The state controls the vast majority of land in this country, and accessing that land is extremely difficult, therefore time-consuming, costly, etc. If we look at electricity, as Thilan mentioned, our electricity prices are high, makes us not competitive. If we take the labor market, Sri Lanka has an extremely unfavorable set of labor regulations. It's impossible almost to make somebody redundant, which especially in a time where you have to adjust your labor supply, makes the cost of labor very expensive. And because of our underinvestment in certain types of education, in particular mathematics and English education, adjusted for productivity, our labor isn't often that cheap. Then we have the whole governance side of things that Thilan referred to. Getting anything done through the state system is extremely difficult because you have institutional fragmentation, you have red tape, you have a lack of digitization. So all this makes Sri Lanka quite an expensive place to do business. And what we need to do is really focus on reducing these costs, enabling foreign investment to come in, generating those exports, which will generate the jobs and productivity improvements our country so desperately needs.
Now, the question is, given the policies that he's in favor of, which are very much keep the government out of the economy and let the market work, question is, how then does manufacturing magically develop? And why is it manufacturing in particular? Because it should be the market that determines it. Maybe the market will determine that Sri Lanka should be a country of hairdressers, hairdressers all over the place. That's what's best for the economy. But he is now saying that he knows something that the market doesn't, which is that manufacturing in particular is important to the general economy. Now, that in itself is completely against orthodox theory, where it doesn't matter at all what sector in particular we're looking at. It's just about economic growth in general, and we don't look at specific industries or goods that are being produced. Doesn't matter if it's high technology goods, agricultural goods, it's all the same in this neoclassical theory. But here you get the contradictions, right? He knows that manufacturing is important. Daniel knows that exports are important. But then how are you going to intervene in the economy to specifically promote that sector? That's the question. Because you see how he then goes on to say, well, East Asia, their success was based on liberalization. Liberalization, that's what he says was the key to success in East Asia for countries like South Korea. I don't know if he's ever looked at any data on South Korea or any reports, because just a brief look on those would tell you that the government was heavily involved in promoting manufacturing in South Korea, from the State Development Bank, the Korea Development Bank, to all the tax incentives introduced to get foreign manufacturers to produce there, to all the incentives for Samsung and Logitech to develop. It's been one after the other. And then he brings up Vietnam as well. I'm in Vietnam at the moment, and he's mentioning this thing about cost of production. Because remember from the clip, he was saying global manufacturers are now looking where they should put their next base of production. They're looking for another home, and they're basically looking for the country with the lowest production costs. So rightly so, Daniel is saying, well, we should be one of those locations, but how do we attract these multinationals? And again, correctly for me, he says it's all about cost of production. Where is it cheapest for them to produce? But then it takes a very interesting turn where he says, well, the best solution is that we privatize things like the electricity market, because that'll somehow magically reduce costs. And before that, he's saying Vietnam is one of the successful cases. Well, I can tell you, Daniel, there's nothing private about the electricity sector here. It's just one state company that runs the entire electricity network. And, you know, there's no private companies coming anywhere near that. So, you know, there are electricity prices in Vietnam that I'm not seeing, you know, but then why are all these companies coming here to produce? Or perhaps the secret is actually to have a very efficient public entity run the electricity grid, because that was actually the success of all the East Asian countries. You know, they didn't give the strategic sectors away. They didn't let them be privatized until later on. You know, sometimes later on they let those be privatized when it's less important, when they've already industrialized. But, you know, to say that Vietnam, of all countries, or China for that matter, owes its success to privatization, to liberalization, I mean, then you haven't been there, and then you haven't looked at the data, because it's so much of it is controlled by the state. And of course, the other interesting thing that Daniel mentioned was the element of corruption, where you know, that was a factor in companies not coming to Sri Lanka. And in fact, you know, again, you just have to come to Vietnam, where there's so much corruption all over the place. But the big difference is it's not hindering production, you know, and the evidence is there, of course. Again, all these multinationals are setting up their factories here in spite of the corruption that, you know, cannot be hidden from them. But so here you can see that on the one hand, there is a recognition that manufacturing and exports are the key to development. But the policies, that's where the interesting discussions are. You know, now the economists are slowly getting around to accepting that manufacturing is important, but they still don't want to accept that the policies to get you there are actually state intervention, you know. And we're not talking about Soviet Union style ownership of factories, you know, not that sort of thing. We're talking of how the East Asians did it, which is very sophisticated ways in which the government pushes private companies into manufacturing and pushes them out into the global economy and makes them competitive.
Bram, just to, as you know, RIUNITS Varoufakis has very effectively exposed the energy oligarchs in Europe, under whom we, in the UK, for example, seem to be paying a lot more than we did under the, you know, the inefficient state-run utilities. Are there any studies that we can use to show the comparison of, say, energy prices or electricity between state-run, like in Vietnam, where you are, and some of the private? If not, it's certainly something we can look at doing.
So you would have thought you were setting me up and that we prepared this, but actually, I've seen that one. I've seen that clip by Yanis, but unfortunately, my memory goes on some things, so I can't actually remember what he said. But there's again an interesting segment from that Face the Nation interview. Let's take a look at it. It's from Murtaza Jafferji, who comments on basically he is also pro-liberalization, and he names Australia as his example.
And if you bear with me, that 30 years ago, I went to university in Australia. During my stay there, Australia basically was not the most dynamic economy. It went through a very, very deep recession. And their famous finance minister at that time, Paul Keating, who then became the Prime Minister of Australia, said this is a recession Australia had to have. And they did, once they did the macroeconomic reforms in the 1980s, where they liberalized the exchange rate and they had an independent central bank, etc., they did microeconomic reforms. Or they set up the productivity commission, they looked at transportation, electricity, telecom, all the sectors, trade. Australia was a protective state. Today it is an absolute free trade country. So all those reforms took a few years, but by the mid 1990s and late 1990s, the reforms started paying off. And the media called them the wonder from down under, basically, because for 27 years they never had a recession. Most of the advanced economies were going through business cycles and recessions, but Australia went from strength to strength and strength. And that is shown. What is the Sri Lankan dream? The Sri Lankan dream is to migrate to Australia.
Okay, so first of all, the point he's making is, I agree with that. Australia did actually liberalize and privatize quite a lot of its sectors in the 1980s and 1990s. But the crucial thing is, by that time, Australia was already an advanced country, So this is where the big difference is, where you should realize that the policies for developing countries are going to be completely different than those for advanced countries. There'll be some similarities, because as we can see now, the advanced countries are, going back on some of their liberalization and privatization policies. But it's especially important for a developing country like Sri Lanka to not look at what Australia did in the 90s and say, right, let's do that right now. That'll bring us success.
Countries that were in far worse positions. Sri Lanka was ahead of Korea in the 50s. We were ahead of a number of Southeast Asian countries in the 60s and 70s. We were ahead of Vietnam in the 90s. Now we're behind all these countries. So our record has been very poor, and we need to sit down and identify those causes. And the causes have been poor governance, not having checks and balances in our system, having an overmighty state, both in terms of the number of people the state employs and the number of things the state tries to do, instead of focusing on its core competencies of providing public goods like education, healthcare, public infrastructure, and allowing markets to operate, allowing competition to operate, allowing Sri Lanka to engage with the world. So I think these are going to be some of the key factors that we should look for in manifestos going forward.
Right. And so, because if you look at, let's say, from 1960 to 1980 in Australia, we saw incomes increase tenfold. And this is that period that Murtaza admits is a period where Australia was actually not liberalized and a lot of sectors were not privatized yet. And then in the period that he's talking about, say 1980 to 2000, we see GDP per capita only something like doubling in that period. So, and of course, growth was slowing because it had become an advanced economy. But the crucial thing is, in that period of rapid growth in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't liberalized, it wasn't privatized. But now, the even more interesting thing is when he gets to his example in Australia, which is the electricity market. Because, my God, I don't know if he's seen the most recent developments there. But I actually did a bit of research because I had seen some things about the electricity market in Australia, and basically the failures of the massive privatization that happened in the 90s, and came across this very interesting article from the Jacobin. And basically what happened was in July of 2022, you got electricity prices like in so many parts of the world following the invasion of Ukraine. You got the electricity prices rising quite a lot in Australia, and they started really spiking in July of 2022. And so then you get the regulator in Australia putting a market cap on electricity prices, right? In July of 2022, because at a certain rate, most people can't afford it, and it was causing absolute chaos. But when they put that market cap on, what happened is the private companies that were producing the electricity said, right, at that price, it's no longer profitable for us. So we're going to refuse to produce, refuse to produce, to supply energy at these prices. So then, it's hilarious that, so I'll read this bit, right? It says in this article from the Jacobin, in response, AEMO, which is the regulator in Australia, shut down the market for the first time since the National Electricity Management was established. For the week it was shut down, the system ran somewhat like it did prior to privatization. A central authority told generators how much electricity to dispatch and when. The only difference is that under the neoliberal market structure, so the one that they have now, the companies that ran at a loss during this period will have their costs covered through high power bills. All up, this will amount to about $1.5 billion. And there's an interesting case from one of the provinces. The article goes on and says, in response to the shutdown, New South Wales Energy Minister Matt Keane implored companies to do the right thing by their customers and the country. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese publicly acknowledged that there was a bit of gaming going on, but used similarly gentle language. I mean, what we have here is a country held hostage by the private companies in the electricity market. I mean, they run the show. They have all the power. And in a situation like this, you can see how they turn the screws, and then you get the government asking them kindly to to behave in a normal manner. And I mean, these are some of the things that that we can see are the issues when you start privatizing a strategic sector like electricity. And I mean, there's one more bit in the article which is really interesting. I can read that as well. It says in 2014, AGL, which is a private energy company, bought 2 coal plants from the New South Wales government, giving the company control over a massive proportion of total coal-fired power in the NEM, which is the electricity market. When Victoria's Hazelwood coal plant closed 3 years later, AGL started flexing its market power in this new supply-constrained environment. According to a Victorian Energy Policy Centre report, higher prices had little to do with increased costs. AGL imposed them simply because it knew that the market operator had little choice but to accept them. The report concluded that AGL's exercise of market power gave it a 60% bump in wholesale profits and raised all coal generators' profit by almost $3.5 billion. I mean, this is the level we're talking about, and this is the Australian taxpayers being scammed, basically. And so,
that is
I
colossal.
think, yeah, that's colossal. And I think these are the facts that are being completely ignored when economists are praising of the market system, where they don't realize that certain sectors of the economy just can't be made into competitive marketplaces, because the argument is always like it was with Enron. I think, Howard, you can say a bit about that, where the expectation was always, well, we don't worry that much about companies establishing a monopoly position and then messing around with the system for their own benefit, because we'll have regulators that will regulate the market, and then everything will be best. But Howard, you have the case of Enron, I think, clearly in your memory, isn't it?
Yes, my age allows me to have that. Where basically Enron was one of 6 companies that was set up in California under the privatization of energy. And they had a regulator that was supposed to keep them separate. But unknown to the regulator, or maybe known to the regulator, Enron bought the other 5 companies and established a monopoly, even holding California to ransom by introducing blackouts unless California actually paid the exorbitant rates that Enron were charging. And this was the absurd situation that the richest part of the entire planet had energy blackouts like we did in Sri Lanka in 2022. So, we were not alone. It was also there with Enron. I wanted to say another thing, and this is what has been puzzling me, is you just have to do a little research, not even very much research, to see the abject failure of the privatization of public utilities. I was on a panel together with an advisor to the Thatcher government, the Sri Lankan. I forget his name now, but every time I mention that, everyone knows who it is. And it was expected he would be my bitter opponent in this discussion. It turned out that he entirely agreed with me and gave facts and figures showing the failure of so much of the privatization that he himself was responsible for. Now, that together with lots and lots of evidence that we have from all the privatizations in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and now the reversal of those processes, and yet we have in Sri Lanka people still justifying and mouthing this with no evidence to support them. And I find this absolutely shameful, because after the fact, you can't do anything about it. Look at the water situation in the UK. It's a disaster, and they don't know how to get out of it. After privatizing, the quality of water has deteriorated so badly in the UK that there are 2 areas that they advise people not to drink from taps. They also advise people not to swim in the sea around the UK in certain areas, because the water companies, instead of treating the water, are just pouring it into the sea and accepting the fines that are being imposed on them as part of the normal costs. So all these people who are getting illnesses, skin problems from swimming in the sea, this is just a cost of doing business with these new private utility companies. What I can't get is, with all this evidence, how people have the audacity and temerity to say what they say is beyond me. I asked them, okay, give us the evidence. Show us the evidence. No. Everybody knows that public utilities are corrupt and it's all bad and so on and so forth. Yeah, okay, come on, give us some evidence of a privatization that has really worked. energy.
Well, then usually the argument turns into, well, Sri Lanka is completely different, you know?
Yeah. It'll
Before
be
it was no,
the first example of its kind. Then, after disaster strikes, they get on a plane and go off to their London apartment or to their Paris apartment, something like that, while everyone else in Sri Lanka is faced with the deteriorating quality of life. I find this absolutely shameful and disgraceful. And I find it even more shameful and disgraceful that our so-called academics do not actually stand up and say, no, wait a minute, you haven't done any studies on this. There are plenty of studies to contradict what you're saying, etc. No. Whoever gives them a contract or a consultancy to write this paper or that paper, validating this or that policy, they'll go with it. I mean, that is where we are with
Actually,
so many of these things.
Howard, economics used to make sense some decades ago. They did say that it's not in the strategic national interest of a country to privatize energy or the security forces or telecom, strategically important things. And they used to say monopolies are bad and they interfere with free markets. It's wrong to have monopolies. Then there was a very strong emphasis on the Monopolies and Mergers Commission and other such regulatory organizations that used to proactively look out for monopolies and take action to mitigate the harmful impact of monopolies. But now we seem to have forgotten all that, and we seem to be in an era where we're quite happy to be in monopolies where the private companies control all kinds of aspects of human activity.
I think so. And one of the interesting things there, Roshan, is that countries like China are different. They don't tolerate monopolies because they actually believe in capitalist competition, and they fuel that competition, which they know is the basis for rapid technological change. For them to harbor monopolies is actually contrary to their entire industrialization effort. The idea is to have highly competitive companies that are constantly revolutionizing technology. You can see one of the consequences is with Apple. Apple is not really an innovative company any longer. It had a huge advantage when it started, but that advantage is dissipated. I mean, apart from its home market, it's actually losing out to the Chinese companies, but also to Samsung, because these are very competitive companies that are rapidly making Apple less and less relevant in terms of much of the electronic gadgetry that they were at the forefront of developing. And if Apple didn't have its monopoly ecosystem, I think you would see a much quicker demise of this. I think one telling thing
that's even in spite of the US government trying more proactively to give Apple a monopoly position. Do you remember when they started imposing all these blocks on Huawei?
Right.
And, this was a couple of years ago, and then Huawei sort of disappeared from the scene, especially in the smartphone business. And now, it just took them a few years. They're back and they've displaced Apple again as the #1 phone, dominating sales. But you can see that, the US government is trying everything it can to compensate for Apple's lack of competitiveness, but it's not working.
I think telling, Bram, did you read today the disclosure that Warren Buffett has been dumping Apple stock?
I saw that, yeah.
Massively.
For treasury bonds, he's
That's
going
right.
for now, isn't it?
And he bought Apple because He likes buying monopolies.
He's going to call up my stockbroker. Sorry.
Apple too. So you know what? Here's something, right? Now, this is going to let the cat among the pigeons. Like what Bram just said, why is the government supporting a private entity? Do they have vested interests? Is Apple sharing data with the government? I don't know. Is this something that we can talk about openly? Am I allowed to do that? Will I still be here around tomorrow? Or, but you know, is it like the elephant in the room?
Yeah, I mean,
Very good question.
You have Howard and I came across this website the other day. I forget the name of it, but they have an extensive list of the largest US companies and every single subsidy they have gotten over the last 50 years or something like that. And you would not believe how much, you know, it's not just the sums. They're like Amazon alone will have about 200 cases of subsidies granted for all manner of projects. And you know, you can just go through the whole list. It's all of them. It's Tesla, it's Apple, it's Ford, you know, all the car companies are there, Nvidia is there. Because this has always been the game. This is what Mariana Mazzucato said in her book, The Entrepreneurial State. It's a complete myth that the successful countries like the US got there by private entrepreneurship, like that they got there because of the smarts of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and you know, Tim Cook. And she makes the point, every single one of those companies actually got massive backing from the government. And she goes further and shows that the government itself has a lot of departments and institutions that actually develop technology internally, right? So the best known one is the internet, which came from the US military and then was handed to the private sector so that they could develop it further. But, you know, it has to be acknowledged that the internet wouldn't be here if it weren't for the entrepreneurship of the state, which is the way she puts it. And same one, which I had no idea was the case, is that the screens, which every single phone on the planet has now, the touch screen, came from a US entity, a US government entity, which handed it over to Apple for it to use in its smartphone. So she said, how clear do you want the evidence that the state is actually crucial to technological development? You know, because the thing is, she got the point that the state is the only one that can actually do long-term planning. Companies are always very short-term, you know, whatever makes them a profit this year or next year, that's what they go for. So why would they invest in technologies that, first of all, they have no idea whether it will be useful or not, right? I mean, that was the case with the internet. The government is constantly doing research and technology development in areas it has no idea whether it's going to be applicable or not, or if it will be useful in 100 years' time or now or tomorrow. And so that's why it's the state that can only do certain types of things. And private entities are limited in their ability to be entrepreneurial.
What would be interesting is if we have any findings to back the theory, that's typical theory or a similar theory with Facebook. I mean, you know, where did they come from? Why did they get so big? How are they so big? And how are they still maintaining pole position? And, you know, he's one of the richest men in the world.
Jerome, yeah, if I can just weigh in on your question about the integrity of politicians. There is a letter from the US Senate. Let me just share that up on the screen here. So it's from the US Senate, and it's addressed to the International Criminal Court, no less, April 2024. Its last paragraph goes as far as to threaten the judges at the ICC. It states the United States will not tolerate politicized attacks on ICC by ICC on our allies. Guess who that is? Target Israel and we will target you. If you move forward with the measures indicated in the report, we will move to end all American support for the ICC, sanction your employees, your associates, and you and your families from the United States. You have been warned. So, I mean, that's pretty clear. And then actually the tracked APAC organization has put price tags to each of the senators who've signed this letter. I won't go through their names, but you see the senators there with their price tags. So if you want to lobby the energy giants or whoever, you've kind of got the price to factor in. Would that go under capital investment or recurring cost or what? I'm not sure, but this seems to be
might be the marketing budget, but I'm not sure.
And yeah, another great example was COVID, of course. We won't open a new can of worms, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there were similar
Absolutely.
gray lines. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something we could put on our next podcast about what, the implications and of post-COVID vaccinations and the findings that are coming out now. Anyway, right. So, gents, in the interest of time, I think we've had a very, very good session, and I hope that our viewers find it as interesting as we did. And I would like to thank all of you, Howard from the Netherlands and Bram for joining in from Vietnam, and Roshan, obviously yourself as well. Thank you for taking the time.
How about a closing remark, Jerome?
Sorry?
How about a closing remark from Professor Howard and everybody?
Yes, definitely. Why not? Yeah, why can't we have a little quick
what to look forward to?
What to look forward to, and if there's any worrying signs that we need to be careful of. And then we'd like to wrap up and say thank you very much to everybody.
Actually, it's more like an anecdote than a closing remark. Is given what I hear nowadays with so many pundits approving of the IMF policies and the policies that we have basically that have screwed Sri Lanka for so long, I'm reminded of Adam Smith and his recommendation to the United States. So he wrote a letter to the US Congress where he advised them that they would be best served by continuing to be an agricultural economy and giving up on the idea of producing manufactures. Okay, this is Adam Smith, considered to be the originator of modern economic thinking. And that was his advice. And similarly, we had another successor to Adam Smith, David Ricardo, saying the same thing, more or less, that the US will be best served by producing according to their natural comparative advantage, which is, again, agricultural goods. And in all cases, this was completely ignored by the US policymakers and most academics, most American academics, because they understood there was only one thing that made countries successful, and that was manufacturing. So, we have in those contexts almost universal rejection of basically the nonsense propaganda that we're fed about what is in our best interest, and people actually thinking critically and looking at history and looking and understanding what really drives success.
How on earth did they become the workshop of the world then, the US?
I hope.
Alexander Hamilton, ever heard of him? I mean, that's I'll tie my closing statement to that of Howard, where we've both been reading quite a bit on this period, and Alexander Hamilton, who Who was his main opponent again in the debates?
I don't know his main opponent, but he kept quoting List.
Yeah, but he had an opponent in I think the U.S. Senate, if it already existed at that time.
Right.
But
right,
anyway,
right,
that
you're right.
yeah, and with the point that they were trying to make with this anecdote is that actually it was it almost went in the other direction. They almost listened to Adam Smith and didn't support manufacturing and
True.
remained an agricultural economy. But if you look at how they eventually took Alexander Hamilton seriously, who was from beginning to end discussing how in every way they could promote manufacturing at that time. So of course the biggest one then was garments and textiles. So that's the one he had his eye on in particular. And the criticism often is, oh yeah, no, that guy, he was just in favor of tariffs, to protect US companies. It was purely a selfish thing, and that's always the mistake. What's best for every country is if everyone just adopts free trade. But first of all, it wasn't just the tariffs. It was because tariffs were the main method countries were adopting at the time to protect their infant industries. So those industries that hadn't yet developed, they sought to protect them until they became competitive enough for them to survive on their own. But he came up with so many other policies that it involved actually transferring a lot of the know-how and technological capabilities from Britain at the time, because they were the main manufacturer at the time. So they needed that technology, and so he adopted several policies to make sure that transfer happened. Of course, nowadays it's a bit subtle and the gray area where you invite the multinationals to your country and try somehow to get the transfer of technology. But back then it was a lot of industrial espionage. So Alexander Hamilton came up with a lot of policies that actually attracted businessmen, workers from factories in the UK, in Britain, to come to the US and tell them what they knew. How could they replicate the success? And that's, I mean, the most prominent example is the steam engine. It's not like the US did what Britain did all over again and somehow invented the exact same steam engine there. They of course got that technology from Britain. And so this is what it's always been about. You have to promote manufacturing. And from the very first country, they knew that had to happen. And it's technology in particular. And I think, just to end on what I was saying before, this optimism towards India, I think that's India's problem at the moment. The policies, there are some policies for sure that are trying to get manufacturing going, but they're nowhere near what they need to be, and what China has been doing for 30 years, which is, adopting thousands and thousands of policies that in every way promote manufacturing, and especially higher and higher technology manufacturing. And as Howard said, the competition, because this is probably Modi's other problem, is that he has promoted above all else companies that are said to be very close to him, like the Adani Group and like Reliance, that those in particular are benefiting from his policies. But where are the competitors to Reliance and Tata and Adani Group? Those, because that's the only companies we know. Whereas you go to China, well, to be fair. The rest of the world only knows about BYD, but you actually go to China and check out the car market there. More than 100 definitely are into EV production. Did you know that Xiaomi, who was always a smartphone producer, now produces EVs as well? I mean, this is the insanity there, is that the competition is going mad. You know, everyone's getting to these industries. But that's what you need, especially in a country as big as China and India. You can't have monopolies running the place. It's not going to be sustainable.
Brilliant.
My one's going to be much more brief than Bram's one. Just to wrap up.
Apologies.
Not at all. It was fascinating. It's a caution, I think, just to remind people that apathy has a price. People should exercise their political power and their economic power. Political power can be boring. Many of us don't like politicians, nor do we like to know about them, but to the extent that many of the things that we discuss here needs political championing, at least a sea change. So wherever you are in the world, you may need to at least involve yourself to the minimal extent. And your economic power, consumers change the world. We would still probably have slavery today had it not been for the first known boycott in the world in the UK against the sugar trade, when they realized the horrors of what's taking place in the slave trade. People organized themselves to say, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Hence, the boycott movement began, and people had to change and take on board these genuine concerns. So really as individuals, to exercise our powers in the economic and political spheres, I think. It doesn't mean you have to go out and start a political party or open a bank, but bear in mind what Malcolm X said about the media. They'll soon have you cheering the people who are being oppressed and cheering for the people who will be doing the oppression. So extremely wise words. Little glimmer of hope very recently with the student movements in the developed world, especially. Where we can expect global change from. It's really heartening to see, students in the US and UK going out there. Makes me wish I was a university student once again. Cheers, guys.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roshan and Joe.
Thank you, all of you. And for our viewers, I would like to say this, obviously, I hope you found it as interesting as we have. And if you did, please do like the video, share it as much as you can. Obviously, there are other people who could benefit from what has been spoken about today. And watch this space, because obviously we're going to come out with more and more of this sort of podcasts. I would like you to subscribe to it if you could. And if you'd like to know when we release our next podcast, then obviously you would like to click on that notification button. And you will be notified when we release a new one. So again, thanking all of you, thanking our viewers, and thanking the guests and our hosts. We'd hope to see you soon again.